So thanks everyone for being here for our last environmental ethics seminar of the semester. Um, Hard to believe that we have like just a few days, like a week and a half of class left. But yeah, I'm really excited for tonight's seminar. We've got Kyle Runion. Kyle is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Geospatial Research over in the Department of Geography, and did his PhD work in Texas. Both of those times related to Georgia's coastal marsh. And so it's the talk tonight. See the title, Rising Tide Does Not Lift All Boats, Resilience and Vulnerability of Coastal Ecosystems. And I can focus heavily on marsh ecology. And so get ready to learn about Georgia's salt marsh and some of the things that are happening to it, and probably ways that we can advocate for continued resilience of Georgia's marsh. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, as mentioned, the title of my talk is The Rising Tide Does Not Lift All Boats. And I just want to say off the bat, if you have any questions, if you want anything cleared up, please just raise your hand and let me know. I'm happy to explain along the way. And I want to start off by thanking a lot of co-authors, a lot of people who have helped with field and lab work and data and stuff. And you can see a bunch of different organizations there, as this work has a lot of the research that I'll present in sort of the second half of the talk, as mentioned, emphasizes my PhD research that I'm continuing on here at UGA. So a little bit of background just about me. I call myself a landscape ecologist, and I kind of put that in quotes because that really combines a lot of different fields and studies. So I think about plant physiology, soil science, hydrology, and then I really use remote sensing and data science as tools to answer questions we have about all of these things. And really how I got interested in doing research was thinking about environmental aspects and how we can see sometimes really subtle responses to chronic stressors. So coastal ecosystems are really dynamic in terms of the flooding and what they face with sea level rise and climate change, but they offer a really great model ecosystem to think about really small scale changes to chronic stress like sea level rise. And a lot of the research that I'll talk about and some of the background I'll give in this talk really focuses on Sapelo Island. So there's a picture. I've been going back and forth, and this was just last month, taking some soil cores. So for the talk, I want to first start off with a brief history, thinking about Georgia's salt marshes and why they have been this really important part of the field, really in pioneering ecology as a whole, but more specifically salt marsh research and ecology. Talk a little about the cultural significance there. And then I want to give just a primer on blue carbon, what we call really these coastal ecosystems and some of the ecosystem services we get from them. And then I'll spend the second half of my talk emphasizing salt marsh resilience against sea level rise. And as I was preparing for this talk, I was looking at the College of Environment and Design, and I saw that you all have an emblem, and I think that that's really cool. That being the sea oats. And the quote from the website, I'll just read it out quickly. Sea oats exhibit the beauty of form and function characteristic of nature. Consciousness of such a value in nature is one basis of environmental ethics. And I think sea oats are really cool, but I'm going to suggest maybe an emblem for the marine science side, when we're thinking about salt marshes, and another picture of a salt marsh here on Sapelo Island. And we're looking at just one species that's covering this whole field of a coastal salt marsh, and this is Spartina alterniflora. So this is a really important plant species in terms of the value we get from coastal marshes. And it's also just really takes over the whole coastline on the southeast here. So the common name for it is smooth cordgrass, but the name Spartina is just so iconic. That's what I'm going to call it throughout the talk. And this is sort of alluding to some of the research I'll talk about, but I think a lot about the roots, about the below ground biomass, and really a lot of the plant actually exists beneath the surface, so I think that's an interesting aspect to study about it as well. So as I mentioned, it forms these really broad fields of coastal wetlands. It has a global spread, and it's often referred to as a cosmopolitan species. So it's present on each coast in the US, and it's also very prevalent in China, but it's actually an invasive species there. So although we really value Spartina, they don't so much, as it's taking over from their native species. But that means that there's really a lot of research going on into Spartina. And another reason that it's really interesting to study is that it is this we call low marsh species. So in this picture, as I'm facing, you can see a little bit of the maritime forest and the upland in the background of the picture there. There's the marsh in front of me, and behind me is the open water, the sea. So Spartina really occupies that transition between the land and the sea, and that means that it is at the forefront of sea level rise. It's one of the first ecosystems and species that's experiencing increased flooding. And Spartina is a big deal, just culturally as well. I grew up watching the Colbert Report. I don't know if anyone else here did, but Stephen Colbert has a production company named Spartina. So before I even realized it, I was seeing Spartina showing up on the screen every night. And if you recognize that little animation on the left, I can still hear the little sound effect that goes along with it. But it's also a big deal in the scientific literature. So here I just pulled out, this is a paper from 2008, thinking about, it's titled Geographic and Taxonomic Biases in Invasion Ecology. I mentioned Spartina is invasive in China, and it's in the top 10 here of most intensively studied invasive species. I couldn't find a list for non-invasive, but I imagine it'd be up there as well because it's just really one of the most well-studied plant species on the Earth. So much so that there's even a paper about the papers of Spartina. So this paper here was titled Research Hotspots and Trends in Spartina Alterniflora Studies, and they even threw in this little word association graphic, just showing how much people are thinking about this one particular species. They even put in this plot that shows the institutions that are publishing most frequently about Spartina. You'll see a lot of universities in China there, but also University of Georgia. And I just started at UGA over the summer, so I'm taking every opportunity I have to say go dogs. And really that UGA being such a big part of coastal wetland, coastal salt marsh, and Spartina research comes from the University of Georgia Marine Institute, or UGAMI. So this is a Marine Institute on Sapelo Island here in Georgia, and it really was the birthplace of a lot of the salt marsh research. In the 50s, there was this meeting on Sapelo Island, and it's really like a seminal paper, seminal set of research, always titled Preceding Salt Marsh Conference, held at UGAMI on Sapelo Island. And so pictured here is Eugene Odom, who the Odom School is named after, who I learned helped set up this certificate series. And he's often called the father of modern ecology. And so I want to take us to Sapelo Island a little bit. So here is just some aerial imagery of Sapelo. You can see it's on the coast, so it's a barrier island, but it is almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely undeveloped, uninhabited. So it's this really set of pristine ecosystems. As you can see, it has, along the coast, there are sandy beaches. There's an area of this maritime forest, and then a little further inland, kind of behind the barrier island, there are these broad sets of coastal salt, brackish, and freshwater marshes. Because of UGAMI, which is located right around here on the southern portion of the island, it has this really extensive research, probably one of the places on the Earth that has been most well studied in terms of the natural environment. And it also has a really rich cultural history. You might see on this map, on this image, there's no bridge to Sapelo, so you have to take a ferry to get over there. But there is still a culture of people who live on the island. And I really wanted to include this, but I also want to include the disclaimer that this is probably an understatement. I'm not an anthropologist, but I think this is an important thing to think about when we're talking about this land, and that the Gullah Geechee are a group of people who occupy the lowlands from Florida to North Carolina. They are descendants of enslaved West and Central Africans who are really using this land to preserve their culture. And I think that we have a lot to learn from the traditional ecological knowledge. So I really like this picture showing that they've been with the land a lot longer than we've been studying it. But I'll get back to sort of what I can explain a little bit better in terms of coastal wetlands. So we're looking at another aerial imagery of Sapelo Island. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is just, again, the spread. You can see in this sort of purple color here, these are all wetlands. So on the backside of these barrier islands, we get these expansive salt, brackish, and freshwater marshes. You can see they really go all the way inland, kind of up until they hit development. They're really expansive. These marshes can be found as far as 30 kilometers inland from the boundary of the ocean. And I just think coastal wetlands are really cool for a couple of different reasons. We get a lot of ecosystem services from these areas, one of them being habitat for birds, for fish, for different crabs and other species that really drive a lot of economic and cultural value. These ecosystems are important for coastal flood mitigation. So as coastal storms reach the land, just the presence of all of these grasses helps buffer wave energy, helps absorb water, reduce the peak height of more inland flooding, and we can put a dollar amount on this. So a study found that in major hurricanes, having just 1 hectare, so 100 by 100 meters of a salt marsh, protected about, or reduced property damage by about $33,000. So they have a really important value, and maintaining them along our coast is really in our best interest. And one of the things that I think about salt marshes for a lot is carbon storage. So as these plants are photosynthesizing, a lot of these salt marsh grasses are taking that carbon and storing it in the soils. So this is kind of what I alluded to earlier as blue carbon. So it's just this carbon that we're storing in tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, and specifically tidal wetlands. They have a disproportionate amount of carbon storage. So they can store up to about a quarter of the world's soil organic carbon stock, while they only cover about 5% of the world's land area. So they're doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of carbon storage. And I think Georgia, for a couple of reasons, is a really amazing place to study salt marshes. So here I'm showing the total area of tidal marshes along the southeast and Gulf coasts. And so by this metric, Georgia's right in the middle here. Louisiana is by far the most, but I want us to look at this map and think about just the length of shoreline. So aside from Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia has the shortest length of shoreline here. So when we start to think about tidal marsh now density instead of just area, so that is the area of tidal marshes per mile of shoreline, Georgia all of a sudden rises all the way to the top. And that highest density of tidal marshes means that the Georgia coast has the most dramatic potential change. We're thinking a lot about change in these ecosystems because, as I mentioned, they're at the forefront of sea level rise. And over the long term, there's been a pretty standard sea level rise rate of about 3 millimeters per year. So here I'm just looking at sea level at a tide gauge in Fort Pulaski, Georgia. And so for decades, we can see there's lots of bouncing around, but it averages out at about 3 millimeters per year. But if we look at instead the past decade, that rate of sea level rise has jumped all the way up to greater than 10 millimeters per year. So it's really uncertain of whether these ecosystems are going to be able to keep up with this. Sea level rise, really the mechanism at which it's a threat to coastal wetlands is by this increased flooding. These plants are adapted to salt water and to regular flooding, but with sea level rise, when that flooding depth and duration is increasing and increasing every year, we're not sure if these plants really can combat that. So as I start to get into sort of transitioning this intro to research, really when we're thinking about understanding salt marsh function and resilience, we ask this basic question, and we kind of plug and play whatever we're actually interested in studying. But sort of we can set this framework up of how do we quantify change across space and across time, and how do we develop driver-response relationships? So how do we understand what's happening in the abiotic ecosystem and how that's affecting what we care about or what I care about, these salt marsh grasses? So I'm going to look at this in two sort of examples. First, a framework of a large-scale research partnership, and then apply that as a specific example to my research. So that large-scale partnership is the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Research Project, the GCE LTER. This runs out of UGA here. It's this massive research partnership. It spans 17 different institutions across the US. There are 34 principal or affiliated investigators. There are many, many more grad students and undergrads and people working on this really large-scale project. It's been going on for 25 years, and as it says coastal ecosystems, it really is focusing the research on any ecosystem that occurs there. So from the upland, the maritime forest, down to the fresh, brackish saltwater marshes, down to submerged, so subtidal, SAV and different sea grasses. So it's a really amazing sort of framework to try to understand holistic changes in the ecosystems. And I just want to mention it's one of 27 different LTERs, and this is kind of the framework that the GCE sits in that allows it to have an outsized impact. The LTER network has been going on since 1980. They really have any question you might have about the natural environment, they have a research area that's going to cover that. So as you can see in the map there, they span all of the United States. They even go down to Antarctica. They have lots of different ecosystem types. And one of the really cool things about being in this sort of network is this ability to do cross-site synthesis. So even among just the coastal sites, you can see the GCE is up here, and these coastal sites are in, if you can make out these light blue dots here. But there have been really cool studies where each of those coastal LTERs along the East Coast have done a similar study, and then we can do a sort of large-scale latitudinal analysis, thinking about how different climate responses really are, or how different climate impacts are driving responses in coastal ecosystems. And so jumping back to the GCE LTER and really setting up how I'm going to fit my research into here, the overall goal of the GCE is pretty vague here, to understand estuarine and intertidal ecosystems and how they respond to long-term change. So there's a lot that can be going on in there. And I'm going to walk us through a research workflow that my research is going to follow. This is really something that we can apply to sort of any question we have about what's happening in the ecosystem along the landscape. So when we're thinking about an observational study, we can follow this sort of workflow that I'll walk through. It starts with data collection. So all of these measurements that we're making, all of these, what we're trying to understand about the ecosystem is all based on taking measurements out in the field. And this can be any ecosystem property. So what I'll be showing some research about is measurements of plant biomass. Next, it takes some data exploration. So as we're going out, for example, if we're taking a measurement of plant biomass right here in the marsh, we can match that to some other piece of data. So we can use satellite data. We have tide, climate, elevation. We have all of these ancillary data sources that we can match to the measurements that we're making on the ground. So in the example here, I'm showing marsh biomass and actually the below ground biomass, so the root portion on the y-axis here, and I'm showing just elevation on the x-axis. In salt marshes, we know that elevation is really this primary variable that controls flooding, that controls drainage, controls temperature, controls a lot of these different things. So while there is a bunch of noise in this relationship, below ground biomass, as I'll show, is a really noisy response. we do see pretty distinct relationship. For example, even across this is a 40 centimeter range of elevation, so pretty small change in the elevation we're at in the marsh. We see a distinct low to high response of this metric that we're interested in, below ground biomass. And after we've done some data exploration, and this is just an example of with one sort of variable, elevation, we can do this with water level, we can do this with lots of different things like temperature. We can take all of those relationships and apply them in a numerical model to scale this up. And finally, once we do all this heavy lifting of model building, we can bring this back to answer some ecological questions of how is this property changing over space and time. So my basic research question will be, how does salt marsh plant growth vary over space and time? And to be a little more specific, I want to quantify both above and below ground biomass, so both the leaf and the root material. And I'm going to do this in spartina alterniflora in Georgia coast marshes. And it's really important to think about how much root production or below ground biomass these marshes have. It's really this key aspect of marsh resilience to sea level rise. That's because as these plants are producing roots, the decomposition and decay in these ecosystems is really slow. They're periodically inundated, so a lot of this soil becomes anoxic. These roots are grown and then they stick around and accumulate as organic matter. And so as this organic matter, this PD material builds up, this is driving elevation gain. And if we're thinking about response to sea level rise, elevation gain is really required. So if, long term we're seeing sea level rise at 3 millimeters per year, marsh accretion or elevation gain needs to match that. And again, remember in the past decade, we're seeing 10 plus millimeters per year in sea level rise. So marsh accretion needs to be pretty high to keep up with this. And if it's not able to, really the fate that we see in salt marshes is drowning. So to put it schematically, really we're comparing this arrow of marsh platform elevation change with sea level rise. And if it's not matching, then these marshes that we're studying might be in trouble. And this is what that looks like out on the marsh. So on the, your right, we're looking at a marsh that looks pretty healthy. It's pretty vibrant, pretty lush, lots of vegetation in there. This is on Sapelo Island. Whereas on the other side here, we're looking at a marsh on Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. And we can see the distinct sort of tidal channels. We can also see in the interior areas here, there's all of this ponding where flooding has increased and increased. The plants that likely were there before couldn't keep up with this increased level of flooding. As they die back, we get this permanently inundated area. And so with the loss of that vegetation goes all of those ecosystem services that we cared about. And there can be a sort of sharp tipping point that can occur in this, because as it's a positive feedback loop system, so as flooding increases, that can hinder marsh productivity, that limits marsh elevation gain, and then that just increases flooding. So once this starts, it can be really hard to stop. So just to revisit my research question here, thinking about how do above and below ground biomass vary over time, I'm going to walk through these 4 steps of the research framework to try to answer this question. So starting off with data collection. So I took biomass measurements along the Georgia coast in these spartina alterniflora marshes. In this grayscale map on the side here, we're looking at the Georgia coast. We're zooming into a few different subsets of the coast, mainly around Sapelo Island. Where in total we have 9 sampling sites. I sampled these quarterly for 2 years. So as mentioned, I was in Texas, so I drove back and forth carrying soil samples. And then we have, through the GC-LTR, we have really nice data sets of additional sampling at 4 of these sites, with one of them that has this really long-term, 10-year, quarterly to monthly data set of biomass measurements. So that's really kind of helping us build up our data set here. And as we're setting these sites, we wanted to target diverse environmental conditions. So while each of these sites are pretty close in distance, as we were setting them up, we're targeting different watersheds, different elevations, different nutrient inputs. We're really trying to capture the range of variation that this ecosystem can exhibit. When I say I went out and measured biomass, to explain that a little bit more, to quantify the amount of leaf or above ground material, we did that non-destructively. So we went out into the marsh and measured plant stem heights, and then we have equations that we can plug into. This stem was 50 centimeters tall. On average, it would weigh this much. So we can scale up that way. To measure below ground biomass, we collected a soil core and brought that back to the lab to extract the roots. We also measured a few leaf characteristics that can tell us something about the plant health, those being chlorophyll, nitrogen, and leaf area index. And so this is what soil coring to assess below ground biomass looks like. From going out into the field and placing the soil core, we are collecting that, bringing it back into the lab, washing away the mud and the roots, separating out live versus dead roots to get to a final product like this. And takes a lot of time in the lab, so for every day in the field, it might take a week in the lab to process all of these. And so we did a lot of this here. I think the reason this work hadn't been done before is that collecting below ground biomass cores just takes a lot of time and effort. I collected 576 along this study. Merging that with the GCE, we have over 1,100 measurements. So this is, I'm pretty confident in saying, the most comprehensive in situ sampling of below ground biomass, and I'm going to brag about it because it took hundreds of hours to do. So as we're moving forward, again, we're thinking what environmental conditions, things like flooding, things like temperature, are related to marsh below ground biomass. And as I mentioned, we're going to be doing this through a modeling framework to scale up the relationships that we measured. And we can kind of reframe this question. What pieces of data describe variation and might help us predict marsh below ground biomass? So to do that, I have most of this slide whited out just to lay it out first. We're going to look at a set of different conditions. They're all categorized: biological, climate, elevation, and hydrology. And so what I'll show in a second on the next slide will be a series of plots. Each plot, the y-axis will represent the amount of below ground biomass we measured out in the field, and the x-axis will represent a different metric or abiotic condition. And so each of these points represents a measurement out in the field, and the line represents the average relationship. One of the things we can see, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of noise in below ground biomass measurements. There's not one variable that it's really strongly tied to that can help us predict it. But we do see some variation explained by really a range of diverse variables. And I'm going to focus in on one of these here. So this was the relationship we found for inundation intensity. And so this is a variable we calculated as a proxy for sea level rise. It's essentially describing local flooding, both depth and frequency. And so to zoom into it a little bit more, this is what that relationship looks like at what we would assume to be low rates of sea level rise. There is actually a stimulation in production. You know, these plants are adapted to live in these saltwater ecosystems, so they can stand a little bit of that. But past that, we see this really sharp decline. So that's sort of that, what I mentioned as the positive feedback loop of marsh plants potentially drowning. As sea level rise or inundation or flooding gets too intense, that biomass production really drops off. And so I also want to emphasize this little side note that we found that above and below ground conditions responded differently, right? So there's a different sort of peak or optimal condition of inundation or sea level rise for these two different components of biomass. So this means that there's non-proportional, non-linear growth between these two components. And this kind of points towards the idea that marsh assessments that only consider the above ground might be misleading. Because here I'm showing root shoot ratio, as we call it, or basically just below ground divided by above ground biomass. And depending on what flooding condition or what rate of sea level rise you're at, there can be a totally different amount of below ground for the same amount of above ground. So if an assessment of a marsh is just looking at how much above ground growth there is, that's really missing a big part of the picture here. Okay, so far what we've done is we've collected these, what I'm calling ground truth measurements that we're going to use to calibrate this model. We've related these measurements to different environmental data. The next step is to develop really this prediction model. It's built through a machine learning workflow. And it's basically going to take a suite of different variables, things like elevation, tide records, climate data, and then some above ground plant metrics that we measured out in the field, like above ground biomass, all to try to predict below ground biomass. And so I just wanted to throw up the data sources here. We measured elevation out in the field with this fancy GPS called an RTK. We're using monthly mean sea level and climate data, and we're actually building this sort of ensemble suite of prediction models to assess all of the above ground metrics. So we're predicting above ground biomass, leaf chlorophyll, leaf nitrogen, all just to be able to later predict below ground. And so to explain this model a little bit more, again, it's this prediction model. It uses a machine learning algorithm called extreme gradient boosting. So this is a decision tree regression-based model. Basically, it's just trying to best fit those conditions we saw out in the field to new data. And as we're building it, one of the things we can think about is, well, we're throwing all of these variables at this model. Which of those variables helps us make the most accurate prediction of our target, our below ground biomass response? What we found was that hydrology really strongly really came out as the most important set of features, kind of pointing towards the idea that flooding dynamics and flooding patterns really drive this key ecosystem process. And I'm getting to the end of the model stuff. We can move on to some more exciting topics in a second. But I just want to show model performance. Basically, on this plot, I'm showing the X value here is every observation, what we measured out in the field, and the Y value is what the model predicted that to be. So to interpret this plot, you can basically look at that one-to-one line, the diagonal. Any point that falls along that is an accurate prediction. Overall, we had pretty good spread around that one-to-one line. We had an error rate of about 10%. And to quantify that another way, our root mean square error was 344 grams per meter squared, where you can see our observations ranged from 0 to about 4,000. And as I described this is a published model that people have been working on for a long time. It was first developed by O'Connell et al. In 2021, where at that time it was really this first of its kind tool. Like no one had built a salt marsh below ground biomass tool, even though we've known for a long time that the below ground biomass is this key aspect of resilience to sea level rise. And then as part of my dissertation, I updated this model where I collected all of that data, really priming it for broader application. And so the next really portion of my research I want to talk about is actually answering this question of how does above and below ground biomass vary over time. So we're going to take that modeling framework, again, the below ground ecosystem resiliency model, or BERM for short, and apply it. So the first question that we have to answer before we start to apply this model is, where are we going to apply it? So we're really lucky that through the GCE LTER, some of our collaborators have been doing salt marsh species mapping. So we know throughout the entire state of Georgia, where does Spartina alterniflora, our target species, where does it occur? So when we filter that map down, we have nearly 700 square kilometers shown here of Spartina cover along the Georgia coast. We're considering this at a 30-meter spatial resolution. So basically along this map, each of these black areas are little dots that are 30 by 30 meters. That is really driven through by our satellite data, which we're using the Landsat satellite series. So at that resolution, we have over 300, or over 750,000 individual locations across the coast that have Spartina cover. We also need to set a model time frame. So we set BERM up to make monthly estimates, and we're going to consider the past decade. So when I did this work, that was 2014 through 2023. So that's 120 months at those 750,000 locations. We're going to estimate both above and below ground biomass. And so a lot of work goes into getting all the data to do that and running through the model. But we're going to skip to the results, where first I'm going to show biomass predictions in terms of stock. So when I say stock, I mean the average predicted biomass across that entire decade. And so here's what that looks like across the coast. We're looking at above ground biomass there on the right and below ground here on the left. We saw this in our field data, but I do just want to emphasize this X bar is showing the mean across the entire coast. So you can see that that mean is nearly 4 times as much. The below ground biomass is much greater than the above ground. And while I think this is cool to look at and we can see some latitudinal, some geographical trends, it is kind of hard to see too much at this way zoomed out scale. So we're going to zoom in to 2 different marshes and compare. So I'm going to show this on the next slide. I have them whited out here. But we're going to look at the above ground biomass predictions on the left, the below ground biomass predictions on the right, and just note that they have 2 distinct color bars there. The predictions for this Sapelo marsh here will be on the top and Skidaway on the bottom, and just showing those on the 2 sides in aerial imagery. So one of the really interesting things that we started to find when we were zooming into different marshes is that the above ground and below ground really did not agree among some of these marshes. So take these 2 marshes. The average above ground biomass here is really similar, 223 to 228 grams per meter squared. So how I like to think about it is if you were to go out to these 2 different marshes and look at them and really just assess them, how healthy they are based on how much growth you see, you would say, or our predictions would say, that they're really similar. However, when we start to look at the below ground, now we see nearly twice as much below ground biomass at the Sapelo Marsh as we do here at Skidaway, really just showing that we're missing a big part of the picture if we're not considering this other component. Next, I want to think about changes through time. So here I'm going to be showing the biomass trend in our predictions, and so just defining trend as the average annual % change in biomass over that decade span. So we found that along the coast, the majority of the area increased in above ground biomass. 88% of the marsh area saw an increase, and that rate was at a little over 0.5% per year. While simultaneously the below ground biomass was decreasing. So here we saw nearly 3/4 of the marsh was losing below ground biomass, and that occurred at an average rate of nearly 1% loss year after year. And we see the same sort of story come through when we think about the change in biomass at our 2 different marshes for above versus below. So now I like to think about it as if we were to visit both of these marshes year after year, according to our predictions, they would even be changing at the same rates from what we could see in the above ground, whereas we see that the below ground is declining much faster at this Skidaway marsh than we did see at Sapelo. And we saw that this decline in the below ground biomass, as we kind of saw in our field data, was really driven by hydrology. So this curve looks a lot like, this is the, all of the model results shown in just a single curve. This looks a lot like what our field data looked like, where we see this little increase in productivity for below ground biomass at really low levels of inundation, and then this sharp decline. And I want to give some context to this x-axis here, inundation intensity. Right now it's just this number that goes from 0 to 0.3. So I'm going to put on here, in this black line is the median of inundation conditions at the start of our model application. And a decade's worth of sea level rise is indicated by this shift to the right to that red dashed line. So we can see that on average, that's related to about an 8% decline in sea level rise. And obviously we're on the declining portion of this trend. So another similar decade's worth of sea level rise would be further associated with another 9% loss on average in below ground biomass. And so at this point of the talk, I've been harping on about below ground's declining, but at the same time I said the above ground was increasing. And so with that, you might question, well, are these marshes actually in trouble if we're just seeing sort of a shifting of biomass? And I'm going to show that I think we're finding that these declines in the below ground biomass can later lead to losses of the above ground. We're seeing this lagged effect. So in order to look at this, we identified what I'm going to call AGB, or above ground biomass decline areas. So this was a really small portion of the marsh, just 2% of that area. But these are areas where we saw substantial losses in the above ground biomass. And we're going to split our model application that decade into 2 different intervals, so just the first and the second 5 years of the decade. So we're going to look at the annual trend of biomass in above and below ground for those AGB decline areas and the remaining coast. In this first interval, we see that there's really not much of a difference. So think that Sapelo and Skidaway Marsh. At the above ground, they look really similar. Next, sort of by definition, as we're pulling out these AGB decline areas, we see this reversal, these divergent trends, and this sharp decline for above ground biomass. And what we saw was that those areas that declined in above ground in the second interval, that was preceded by this really steep loss of below ground biomass. So it could be these plants first lose below ground portions that we can't see this change happening, and then later is what's coming with the above ground. And we saw some visual evidence of this as well. It wasn't just in the data. So we're going to zoom into this marsh on Sapelo Island, and we're going to walk through this series of aerial imagery. So here we're looking at the marsh in 2012, and in looking at aerial imagery in a marsh, we're kind of looking mostly for texture. So we don't see much color here, but I promise this is a fully vegetated marsh. We're going to return in 2019. This image is a little grainier, but really we don't see any difference in condition. However, between 2012 and 2019, with this model framework, we were able to detect substantial declines in the below ground at these 4 locations, these 4 squares here. We come back in 2024 and we see a really striking overlap of that area with this sort of dieback area of the marsh. So the above ground biomass is dying back, and in 2019 we couldn't have seen that at all, aside from thinking about the below ground. So this is really driving this conceptual framework that we have, that we think that on the right here, a healthy marsh that first loses some below ground biomass in the center panel here, then becomes vulnerable to total marsh loss. And this is really driven by sea level rise. And one of the things that we found along the coast, we found that much of the marsh area sort of met this classification, met this threshold to be called vulnerable. So over a quarter of the marsh lost a substantial amount of below ground biomass and could be at risk for a similar sort of fate. So to wrap up some of the conclusions from the actual research portion, we're finding that marshes, particularly this low marsh at the forefront of sea level rise, might be vulnerable to drowning. We think that declining below ground biomass, as we're starting to be able to see through this modeling framework, could though serve as an early warning sign of impending marsh loss. And using these tools, we can really pinpoint locations to start to think about restoration. So there are some actions we can take now that we're starting to understand what areas of the coast might need intervention. There are some conservation, there are some restoration actions. I'm just going to touch on one here, because there's actually just one project along the Georgia coast so far that has actually done sediment placement. So this is a restoration technique where you place sediment on the marsh, you build up the elevation, and really you allow these plants to become more productive on their own, and they're going to build that below ground biomass and become more resilient as they're able to drive their own elevation gain. But we've only had one project like this on the Georgia coast. It was a pilot project, so they're doing lots of research about it, which is really encouraging. But it's just 5 acres. It's on Jekyll Island if you're interested. But I think this is really kind of pointing out the scale of our response, the scale of this restoration is not matching the scale of the vulnerability and the scale of potential loss that we're seeing along the coast. But I'm going to try to end on a little bit of a happier note. Partnerships like the GCE really allow us to do this cool research. Their long-term data collection really essentially doubled my efforts of sample collection in the field. And there were a few steps along the way where collaboration through this partnership really broadened our impact. We used that species cover map that really allowed us to think much more broadly than we would have. If we didn't know where this plant is occurring, we wouldn't have been able to apply this model. Also within that berm model, there's a previous study that developed this really cool marsh flooding model. That was a key component that we're only able to do because the GCLTR has been thinking about changes in the ecosystem and doing this research for a long time. And with that, I thank you all for listening. I can take any questions. Yeah.
First of all, I just wanted to say that that was a great presentation. Arguably my favorite of this whole semester. I
Oh,
thought
thank you.
did such a good job with the visualization and the narrative design for the whole thing. But my question is why, I know that at the beginning you kind of touched on how this plant has been researched a lot. But I don't really recall you talking about like why that kind of came to be. Like why was it this plant over a tree or like a different grass or something along the coast? Like what about this plant specifically is so important that it's been researched so widely?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Spartina along the coast like makes up so much of the coastline. That species cover map, it really is the predominant salt marsh species. And I think one of the reasons that in particular salt marshes get a lot of research is they are this super dynamic ecosystem and they have a lot of those ecosystem services tied to them. So that also makes research in marshes really, really hard. Going out and taking measurements, collecting samples is just like everything's a step harder than doing it out in somewhere that's more easily accessible. So yeah, I guess my response to that would be just they're cool. There's lots going on in these ecosystems, and they're hard to understand. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I just wanted to make a note. Along the California coast, it has become invasive, that very same species of Spartina, because they were having trouble with the coastline out there, so they thought, hey, it's doing great in Georgia, and it's a native, we'll just transplant that here. And it has become extremely invasive out there, and it has mated with the variety or the species that's naturally occurring there. So now they have hybrids. It is destroying things out there. So I guess the point I'm making is that what's so great here, even though it's the same country, on the other coast, it's pretty invasive. And I was wondering if you've run into any of that research.
Yeah, I haven't seen as much out of California, and that's really interesting bringing up the hybridization. But I can see why it would take over. It can occupy these really stressful areas really well, so I can see why it would be a problem. It is, yeah, a fascinating sort of study where we have invasive species here that are native in China, for example, so we kind of trade off. Yeah, we love Spartina on the East Coast and don't love Phragmites australis, and it's the opposite in China. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't aware.
There's one more question. What eats the Spartina here?
So what I mostly see eating it is snails. Walking out in the marsh, we always get those stuck in our boots. Lots of snails. A lot of different critters use it for habitat, but direct, I guess, consumption is, I see mostly snails with herbivory.
That's interesting. Anytime there's a food source, something's going to fill it.
Mm-hmm.
And my last question is, because of the increase in amount and severity of storms due to climate change, is that responsible for any of the biomass, underground biomass loss? Because you can see if you've got a huge severe storm, it can actually undermine everything and wash away.
Yeah, so Storm impacts on marshes, I think, is fascinating because it's really dependent on individual aspects of that storm. We actually found, we haven't made a direct link to this, but looking through our data, we see really high amounts of below-ground biomass the year following Hurricane Matthew on the East Coast. And there's a mechanism for that. The storm, if it's coming in on a rising tide, it could bring lots of sediment. If the water level is above the plants, it's not really going to be ripping them out. So it could be depositing sediment, and it could be really like a nourishment for the marsh. But you're absolutely right. If the storm hits at a different direction or different water level, it can cause huge erosion. Yeah.
Would the Spartina, would it normally migrate inland? I mean, over time, would it adjust to the rise in sea level?
So this is the way a lot of people think about it. They call it marsh migration.
Yeah.
So with sea level rise, really, Spartina is on the coast actually because it can't outcompete some of those other species that are in the more fresh areas, but it can handle these more stressful conditions. So as that really like that salt wedge, that saltwater intrusion moves up the coast, Spartina would move up with it. However, if you look at the coastline, if there's a road, if there's some development, if there's something blocking that migration of the marsh, then instead of the marsh just moving inland, it's shrinking.
Yeah. I mean, is a part of the problem that it just doesn't have anywhere to go? It's getting sort of trapped between the ocean and the land. And it's just basically it's run out of. I mean, it's basically imprisoned in between rising seas and I-95. In this case, I mean.
Yeah, so that's some people like in the field consider it, well, these marshes that we have now, we're going to lose to sea level rise, but the marshes are going to move inland. But that exact point of if they can't move inland, that's when the total area of marsh we see is going to decline.
Are you exploring any of those dynamics at all about creating, I guess, escape routes, for lack of a better way of putting it, for the marshes to retreat up some of the river?
Yeah, so I'm not looking at that myself, but I know that lots of people do look at that. They look at those potential migration pathways. There are also nonprofits and land conservation organizations that focus on buying up land that would be in the migration pathway, so that can happen. So there are a lot of people thinking about that.
This issue seems fairly urgent. If 25% of the marsh is vulnerable, and in those 5-year increments, you could see the complete, disappearance of portions of marsh.
Mm-hmm.
Is that urgency? You said there's only been one of the sediment placement projects that's being studied. Like, how frequently will that be ramped up to be a more widespread practice?
It's hard to say. So this is all one step along the way that has the potential to hold this up or really to speed up progress. All of those sediment placement there needs to be permits through the Army Corps of Engineers. They actually have started to, they're developing language to say that, because the Army Corps is responsible for all the navigational dredging, which in our channels, that removal of sediment, that could actually be a prime resource to put on marshes. So they're starting to develop frameworks to try to make that happen more easily, but it's expensive, it's hard to line up where you have the sediment, where you need to put the sediment, and I think we don't know all the times where it needs to be put, how it needs to be put, what thickness it needs to be laid on there. So it's a really difficult project, and project anytime you try to do it, and it's hard to match up what will be a successful project on the ground with potentials. Yeah.
I know this is not your focus of the research, but is anyone else involved with the LTER program looking at kind of extrapolating the loss of Spartina to the ecosystem and what that would do to food chains or habitat, and trying to kind of anticipate some of those outcomes?
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet,
Okay.
because I imagine the impacts would be, it would be massive. And yeah, maybe if we do a study and quantify it,
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's the dollar amounts that you can catch people's attention with. Mm-hmm.
So, the rivers, here, I guess they are freshwater. So during those storms, as they increase and we get more flooding, is there potential to build up silt and maybe help that biomass?
Yeah, so I think, delivery of sediment from the rivers is definitely a mechanism by which they can build elevation. In recent decades, the amount of delivery of sediment from these rivers has declined, but storms that provide that sediment, while that's decreasing water clarity is not good for other aspects of the ecosystem, it would be a benefit, for these marshes.
Perhaps the reason is that we are damming or hoarding off more and more
Mm-hmm.
of our rivers.
Yeah.
That's the result.
Yeah, so what's happening way up the watershed can be affecting us all the way down at the coast and even further out.
Any questions? No? Well, thank you so much. It was
Cool.
Incredible. And then, I guess if you have any other questions or want to say hi to Kyle, come on up. Say hi. If you're in the seminar class, stick around for a few minutes. We can kind of gather you guys some last instructions for the remainder of the semester.
Cool.
Thank
Thank you all
you.
for listening.